Good morning. For those of you who are new this morning, I'm Pastor Ryan, and I'm so glad that you're here this morning. So we have been in our Advent series called Christmas Feels, and we're going to be looking at some of the emotions that surround Christmas and some of the things that we feel this time of year. And one of the things that we say every time we greet someone this time of the year is Merry Christmas. We say Merry Christmas, but if we're honest, there's a lot of times where we're just not feeling very merry. We feel the stress of having to get things done. Sometimes it's a bad day and we're just not feeling very merry, or sometimes we realize that there's a lot of going on in the world that just makes us feel not very merry. A lot of times we feel things, this time of year especially, that make us feel burdened, and we feel a bunch of sorrow. And some Christmases, we feel that burden and we feel that sorrow more than others. And sometimes the added pressure to say Merry Christmas can make all the joy even more difficult to find. And some of us don't feel merry, but we're still really good at hiding it. We're still really good at putting on a fake smile and saying Merry Christmas and making it seem like we feel merry, we feel happy, we feel joyful this time of the year, even when we don't. And so last week, we looked at Zechariah and how God met him in the mundane, brought him from the mundane to feeling awe and wonder. And this week, we're going to be looking at Zechariah's wife, Elizabeth, and how she had gone a lot of her life and felt a lot of the sorrow and shame. And so we're going to be in Luke chapter 1 again. And then in Luke chapter 1, 5 through 7 is where we get introduced to Zechariah and Elizabeth. So verse 5 says that in the time of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. So Zechariah and Elizabeth they're both in that priestly line from Aaron. And the Bible makes it very clear that they were living a blameless life. That what they were doing, they were following God's laws, and they were living a life above reproach, so that nobody would be able to say that what they were doing was wrong. Any accusations brought against them would clearly be false. But it also points out that they were childless. In this time, a common thing was if you didn't have children, you were seen as cursed by God. You were seen as not having God's favor. It was also said that it wasn't good for a Jew to not have a wife, but it was even worse if a Jew had a wife but had no child. And around this time, it was also a woman who was unable to bear children was also a reason for divorce, where the man would just leave the woman to go and find a different one just because she couldn't bear a child. And so Elizabeth, even though Zechariah was faithful and didn't leave her, she still would have felt a lot of sorrow and pain. And not only would there have been just the sorrow from not having family, from not having that thing that they had longed for and prayed for, but there was also a lot of community. The community would have felt shame and bleakness because of the way society looked at her. And this had happened all of her adult life, well into her old age. And so this time of the year where Zechariah was doing his duty, she would have felt that shame and that sorrow from not being able to bear children. And like Elizabeth, there are a lot of people today that have a lot of reasons to feel sorrow around Christmas. It could be like Zechariah and Elizabeth, where they feel lonely, that there's something missing. And for a lot of people, Christmas is hard because it's a reminder of family, but they're separated from family. Especially a lot of college students, they leave home for the first time. And a lot of times, those family traditions they grew up with, they have to try and find their own, and that can feel lonely. There's also people who are feeling grief this time of year, because Christmas is another reminder of traditions that you used to have, and family that used to be around that are no longer there. So a lot of us are grieving this time of year, and there's also the sorrow of unmet expectations. Sometimes we look at the world around us and watch all those Christmas movies and think that's what the picture of Christmas looks like, and then what we have doesn't match up. And so we have an unmet expectation that can make us feel sorrow. But it also can come from the memory of Christmases in the past, where we have all these memories of good Christmases, and then now we feel empty because the present Christmases aren't matching up to the ones we felt in the past. But whatever the reason is for feeling sorrow, there's a lot of reasons for us to feel sorrow at Christmas. But I want to make it really clear that feeling this sorrow doesn't mean you're a bad Christian. It's okay to feel sorrow. A lot of us who grew up in the church had the verse drilled into us that the heart is deceitful above all else and desperately wicked. Who can understand it? And so we think that emotions are something that we're not supposed to listen to, that we have emotions, but we should really follow our reason. And that goes extra for what we call negative emotions, the emotions like anger or sadness or sorrow, that if we're feeling that, then that means there's something wrong with our faith. Or if we're feeling those negative emotions, then it's because we're not trusting God or we're not living in God's will. But that's not the case at all, because God created us with emotions. He created us to feel a wide range of emotions, from everything from happiness and joy and awe to sadness and sorrow and grief. And while a lot of times we feel that sorrow and grief, and it's a reminder of the broken world, it's still okay to have those emotions, because God created us in his image, and God is a God who feels. He's a God who shows sorrow, because God feels sorrow. And if we're created in his image, then it makes sense that we would feel sorrow too. And one time that we really see how clearly God felt sorrow is in John 11, verse 35. It's the shortest book of the Bible, or the shortest verse in the Bible, and it's really simply, Jesus wept. Jesus was fully God and fully human, and he felt sorrow. Jesus wept. He knows what it is to feel sorrow and grief and pain. And this verse is when Jesus was going to meet Mary and Martha. And they met, and they had sent messengers to say that their brother was sick and had died. Their brother Lazarus, who was also a friend of Jesus, was sick and died. And Jesus was going to meet with them, and that's when Jesus wept. He sat down and wept and grieved with the people who were grieving. And so a lot of times after sorrow, there's this time of waiting, because Jesus knew that Lazarus would rise again. He knew that there would be a resurrection, and even Mary and Martha, we see in the story that they knew that Lazarus would rise again because Jesus told them. But they also had faith that he would rise again at the resurrection at the end, when God raises up everybody. So they had this knowledge, and they believed firmly that they would see Lazarus again. They knew it wasn't the end of everything, but yet they wept. And Jesus also knew it wasn't the end of everything, that they would be reunited one day, and that later, just moments later, Lazarus would rise from the dead. But in that time of waiting, Jesus still sat down and took the time to weep with them. And so even though we know that God is going to turn all our sorrow into joy, even though we put our faith in God and know that in the end everything's going to work out, it doesn't always mean that everything will suddenly feel better. And Jesus knew this, and he set the example that it's okay to sit down and weep. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, when he was struggling, he had a thorn in his side. And 3 times he prayed to God, take it away from me. But in 2 Corinthians 12:9, God simply replied, my grace is sufficient. And so while we want things to just magically get better and suddenly feel the joy and just get rid of the sorrow and the grief, we have to realize that God's grace is sufficient. He gives us a message of sufficient grace. It's not that there's only a little bit of grace for a few people. There's an abundant amount of grace for everybody. And sometimes God just comes in and fixes everything, like suddenly and overnight. Sometimes he does substitute that joy for that sorrow. But other times, he does it by transformation. There's a slow process where he's working in our hearts and in our minds. And he's slowly working in us to change that sorrow into joy. And during this process, our feelings will change a lot, but we know that God's promises will never change. And so we know what's coming. We know the future, but sometimes we're still in that time of waiting where we feel that grief and that sorrow. And that's where Elizabeth was in Luke chapter 1, in verses 23 through 25. Here she was given the good news. And she knew that she was going to have a son who was going to be John the Baptist, and that her prayers were answered, and that Jesus, the Messiah, was coming, and that John was a reminder that God keeps his promises, he's faithful, but she was still in a time of waiting. And in verse 23 through 25, it says, when Zechariah's time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and for 5 months remained in seclusion. The Lord has done this for me. In these days, he has shown me his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people. So she knew she was going to have a son. She knew that her prayers had been answered. But there was also this time of waiting as she was still pregnant. She hadn't been able to hold John in her arms yet. She knew the Messiah was coming, but there was still this time of waiting. And so she went into seclusion. She still had to, this time of waiting, she had to go into seclusion. And while she was in seclusion, her cousin Mary came to visit her. And that's in verses 39 through 45. And at this time, Mary got ready and hurried to a town in the hill country of Judea, where she entered Zechariah's home and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice she exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leapt for joy. Blessed is she who has believed in that Lord would fulfill his promise to her." So Elizabeth is in this time of waiting. She's in seclusion. She knows that God has, in one sense, fulfilled the promise that she's going to have a son. She's pregnant. But at the same time, she's still waiting for everything to be made complete. And so even And in this time of waiting, Mary, her cousin, the mother of Jesus, comes to visit her. And when the sound of Mary's voice reaches Elizabeth's ears, she feels John jump for joy. Because even before his birth, John rejoiced at the coming of Jesus. And Elizabeth felt it. So while Elizabeth was in her time of waiting, she found joy by looking to Jesus. And this is a really great example of the already but not yet. Because she was already pregnant with John, but he still wasn't there yet. Mary was pregnant with Jesus. They knew the Messiah was coming, but there was still work to be done. And this is something that we see all throughout Scripture, the already but not yet, especially when we're in a time of waiting. Jesus wept when he knew that Lazarus would rise again. And he knew that there was still work even after he had raised Lazarus from the dead. He knew that one day Lazarus would die again and he would be raised again at the resurrection at the end. But he also knew that there was still work to be done. Jesus hadn't yet fulfilled everything by dying on the cross and rising again. So there is a sense of already, but not yet. Jesus had already come, but he had not yet fulfilled everything that he was going to do. But Christmas is also a reminder that this is going to happen. God keeps his promises. That in this time of waiting, we can find joy by looking to Jesus. And then in verses 57 through 66, we see the birth of John the Baptist. And so when it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." And they said to her, "There is no one among your relatives who has that name." Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbors were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, What then is this child going to be? For the Lord's hand was with him. See, everyone was shocked when Elizabeth insisted the name would be John. And they looked to the father, Zechariah, to see what the son should be named. And see, Zechariah, when he was told that he would give birth to a son, that they would have a son, even in their old age, when that message came to him, he doubted. He said, "How is this possible? I'm old and my wife's old. How is this possible?" And the messenger from God, Gabriel, said, "You will not speak until these things have come to pass." And so then, after John is born, and they decide to name him John, that's when Zechariah's mouth is opened and begins to speak again. Their time of sorrow had turned into a time of joy. And everyone around them heard about this and was talking about it and wondered, what is this child going to be? Because clearly God is present. Clearly God is working in the situation. And so Zechariah, the first thing he did was offer praises to God. See, God offers us joy. And we know normal joy. We know what that's like. That's a normal, everyday experience that we feel. There are days where, we have bad days, but there are other days where we feel joy. But Christmas joy is a different kind of joy. The Gospels and the Bible tell us that Christmas is a time of great joy. In the next chapter, in Luke chapter 2, when the angels appear to the shepherds, they say, I bring you tidings that will be great joy for all people. And so God gives us joy. He gives us regular joy to get us ready for a moment when there will be great joy. See, God gives us joy for great joy to surpass it. Because Christmas is a time of great joy. But Christmas also shows us the great heights of joy. Luke chapter 2, the angels, they say great joy is coming. They bring good news of great joy. But that's not the whole thing. That they were there to show that the lowly shepherds, the people who are on the outskirts of society, the ones that nobody wanted to associate with, the lowest of the low were told about this great joy, and the great joy was for them. But also the great heights of joy, because even heaven was rejoicing. So it wasn't just the low on the earth, but the great heights up in heaven. From the face of the earth all the way up to the highest point of heaven, there is rejoicing about Jesus, the Messiah, who is coming. And as God's glory rises, so does our joy. Because it's not only for the high people, the kings and the leaders. It's for everybody. It goes from the highest of the high to the lowest of the low and everything in between. And so Christmas shows us the great heights of God's joy. But it also shows us the great lengths of joy. See, joy is for every person in every place at every time. When the angels appeared to the shepherd, they said, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all people. So God's joy, the great joy at Christmas, is for all people and shows the great lengths of God's joy. And it also shows the great depths of God's joy, because joy and great joy is deeper than every sorrow. And in fact, Jesus, this child who is going to be born, is going to show us what joy and sorrow looks like. In the prophecies about the Messiah, about Jesus, it said that he would be a man of sorrows, who's going to be acquainted with grief. And we saw that in John chapter 11, when Jesus, the one who was bringing great joy, felt sorrow and wept. And this man who was going to bring us great joy was also going to experience great suffering. But that suffering that he endured, that grief that he felt, that's what secures great joy for all of us. It's what he did, why Jesus came, that we can experience great joy. Because Christmas isn't just a time of God, of us trying to reach God. It's a time where God came to meet us. He met us in our sorrow, in our grief, in our pain. And he lived and walked among us and felt that joy, that sorrow, and that same pain that we feel. And then he suffered and he died for us so we could be rescued from that sorrow, from our sin. Then he rose again so we can be with him, so that our sorrow will be turned into joy. And so the bottom line today is that Christmas reminds us that Christ will turn all of our sorrow into joy. Christmas is a reminder that God will turn all of our sorrow into joy. And when we're grieving, when we're feeling sorrow, we feel the weariness of life and death in this world. And sometimes we wonder how anyone can rejoice. And the life of Jesus that began in that little wooden cradle will culminate in death on a wooden cross. And that's our great hope and our great joy at Christmas. And so, as we're feeling sorrow and as our friends and family around us are feeling sorrow, we can share with those around us the great joy that comes at Christmas. That Christ, who came as a baby and died as our substitute, will one day return. And when he returns, he will bring his kingdom and bring us into his kingdom. And when he does, we are told that he will wipe away every tear, and death will be no more. And there will be no more crying, no more mourning, and no more pain. And Christmas is a reminder that Jesus came to turn all of our sorrow into joy.